The Alco MRS-1 was developed for America's next big conflict, possibly another world war. A conflict which luckily would never actually take place within this locomotive's time. It remains a very rare and unique locomotive. This locomotive has become increasingly rare due to the fact that many of them are being scrapped at an alarming pace, and few of these are left in service or even in existence at all. World War II can be considered one of the most turbulent times in modern history, not to mention traumatizing, and this is not just because of the extreme tactics being utilized by the Axis powers, some of which involving crimes against humanity, not to mention the fact that it took place less than 3 decades after the war to end all wars, better known as World War I. There was also a very turbulent and antagonistic, if you will, aftermath of that war, specifically the 1950s, with relations between the United States and its then ally, the Soviet Union, beginning to break down not long after World War II ended, plus the invention of the atom bomb, seemingly guaranteeing almost instant destruction at the press of a button, and other such events such as the Berlin blockade as well as the Berlin Wall, leading to the start of the Cold War. Not to mention a new conflict that would occur in the 50s between the newly declared North Korea and South Korea that would eventually be unofficially known as the Korean War. With all this information in mind, it became more and more a question of when, not if, another major conflict like World War II would take place. To this end, the United States wanted to be prepared for this sort of conflict, much more than it had been for World War II. At the start of World War II, one of the areas in which the United States was able to prepare at a moment's notice was in terms of rail transportation within the United States itself. However, when it came to helping its allies with rail transportation in other countries, or operating captured railroads, the United States really had no concrete plans. And these plans were very much necessary, as countries like Iran and Russia, for example, had vast, expansive territories where water and coal were very scarce, making steam engines highly impractical. And needless to say, the active conflict which was World War II made these scarcities even worse. The United States therefore had to find a sort of jack-of-all-trades diesel locomotive that could handle this job, as diesel engines by this point had proven to be much more reliable and easier to deal with in terms of being kept fueled and operating in such expansive territories. The only trouble was that no such locomotive existed at this point in time, especially one with a 6-axle truck arrangement that could handle this sort of job. Luckily, however, it was about to have a run of very good luck. What had saved its neck, essentially, was the fact that Alco, the American locomotive company, had developed its first series of road switchers by this point, and had already put them into production. Known as their model RS-1, short for Road Switcher, and Series 1, these locomotives combined all the abilities of a road engine, plus a switcher, and plus a passenger hauling locomotive, all into one convenient package. While these jacks of all trades were adequately, if not somewhat underpowered for the jobs they were doing, their extreme flexibility compensated for much of this. The United States government, seeing how capable and flexible these locomotives were, quickly snatched up the locomotives that Alco had already completed or had in production, via its War Productions Board. The War Production Board then contracted Alco to make modifications to these said locomotives, including changing the cab so it didn't stick out as much to handle low-clearance tunnels, lines, etc. They also ordered that Alco was to put a 6-axle truck assembly underneath the locomotive with a center-powered axle, known as a D arrangement. The 6 axles would allow these locomotives, in addition to improved pulling power, the ability to negotiate very light rails or under-maintained tracks, which could be found upon the Allied railroads they'd be operating on. While this concept might seem very simple on the outset, it was in fact very complicated. You see, the RS-1 was never intended to be a 6-axle locomotive, it simply didn't have the length. And so, in order to accommodate the 6-axle trucks in which the War Production Board had requested of it, Alco would need to make several sacrifices in terms of their designs. Specifically the traction motors, which were mounted so closely together and so awkwardly that the only way to properly service them was to literally drop the trucks off the locomotive. Nonetheless, these modifications to these locomotives were made, with their designs proving very highly successful in use on the Trans-Iranian Railway. The U.S. government was so happy with the results of these locomotives that a similar variation of them was produced for use in Russia under the Lend-Lease program called the DA class. Essentially, these were a modified RS-1 design with a wider wheelbase to accommodate the wider Russian gauge. These locomotives would prove very successful in terms of their reliability, efficiency, and capability. So much so that the Soviets, after World War II, reverse-engineered this locomotive into a model which would be produced within the Soviet Union, referred to as the TEM-1. Nearly 2,000 of the TEM-1s and their successor TEM-2s were produced between 1958 and 1965. An interesting note on the imported Alcos to the Soviet Union is that a few of them were utilized to pull Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin's train to the Potsdam Conference, where the Allies would discuss post-war peace. The Soviet dictator praised their performance, and particularly took a liking to these engines, which essentially sped up the process in the Soviet Union, essentially developing a reverse-engineered version of this engine it would eventually call the TEM class. An interesting note on these Soviet-made locomotives is that much like their American counterparts, they were utilized in the Soviet Union and did eventually in the Soviet Union replace most of the steam switch locomotives for locals as well as switching jobs. With all this in mind, in terms of the success the RS-1 was for the military operations overseas, the USATC, or United States Army Transportation Corps, decided they wanted a similar type locomotive but with some changes to meet more modern standards as well as to be more flexible than its very successful predecessor, the RSD-1, that could be utilized for rail transportation in captured and or allied railways during another armed conflict, allowing for the transportation of supplies as well as troops and anything else that needed to be moved around the unfriendly territory. To do this, the locomotive would need to be very flexible in terms of its ability to ride on different gauges, as well as being low profile as possible to fit the more narrow gauges, as well as tight clearances. These specifications would eventually culminate in the model MRS-1. Initially, all the major manufacturers, including EMD, Alco, GE, as well as Fairbanks Morse, were asked to submit proposals/bids for this particular locomotive model. In the end, only GM as well as GE, who would utilize Alco as a subcontractor for the project, would submit bids. The military designation for this model would be RSX-4, but would be better known by its civilian designation of MRS-1. With the proposals from GM as well as GE received, the USATC commissioned both GM and GE to produce 13 locomotives apiece for consideration as well as testing. The most successful and or capable of reaching the military specifications of these two batches of 13 would receive an additional order of 70 units. These contracts would prove very lucrative despite the lower numbers for either company, as the price per MSR1 produced would be as much as 3 to 4 times, according to reports, a GM GP7, for example, or an Alco RS3. Because this locomotive was to be utilized in several different parts of the world, although mainly Europe, this would lead to this locomotive having to abide by very specific specifications and requirements. The most notable visually of these specifications was the fact that the body had to be as narrow and as compact as possible. This will allow it to deal with very tight clearance areas as well as a variety of different track gauges. More on this later. To satisfy these requirements, we see that the cab has been shaved down and that there are no sharp edges. Everything is rounded off and otherwise tucked in to accommodate these tight clearance areas. The locomotive even lacks railings on its long hood. One of the unique requirements in terms of specifications of this locomotive were adjustable trucks. With many of the less than friendly nations as well as allied nations that these locomotives were to be utilized on having different track gauges, this is to say the distance between the two rails involved. For example, the standard gauge, which is what U.S. trains utilize, is 8 feet and 8.5 inches, or 1,435 millimeters, as opposed to other countries with more broader gauges. For example, Indian railroads operate on 5 feet 6 inches, or 1,676 millimeters, and trains of the former Soviet Union, the Soviet Union at the time that this locomotive was being built, operate on a gauge of roughly 4 feet 11 inches, or 1,668 millimeters. To accommodate these, as well as a variety of other gauges, the trucks on these locomotives had to be adjustable. In addition, to help this locomotive deal with tracks that were poorly maintained or simply not well laid, and or temporary track work, a 6-axle A1A style truck was specified to spread the locomotive's weight on this sort of track. As for horsepower specifications, the US ATC required a horsepower output of 1,600 or 1,600 horsepower. EMD's variant of the MRS-1 would utilize a variation of its 567B, which by this point had gained a reputation for extremely high reliability, not to mention easy maintenance. Again, tuned to make 1,600 horsepower. Interesting note on the 567B. Originally, these prime movers were limited to 1,500 horsepower, as found in EMD's own GP7, as well as F7 locomotives, being the current models the company produced at that time. Initially, EMD planned to install 1,500 horsepower in this locomotive, but it was only under extreme pressure from the US ATC that the company finally relented and made tweaks to the fuel injection system to squeeze the extra 100 horsepower out of the prime mover. Again, in addition to the tweaks to the fuel injection system, this prime mover achieved its 1,600 horsepower with 16 cylinders and 2-stroke combustion, as well as a roots blower and without the utilization of a turbocharger. While the GE variation, which again was being subcontracted out to Alco, would utilize the company's by then rather infamous 244 power plant, specifically its 1,600 horsepower 244D, a same that could be found under the hood of the company's popular RS-3 model, with 12 cylinders as well as turbocharging and 4-stroke combustion. It should be noted that while the D was part of the 244 family and inherited its infamous reputation for cracked blocks, blown turbochargers, and unfortunately, and most notably, broken crankshafts, this version of the prime mover had been upgraded from its previous iterations to at least reduce these problems. EMD's version of this locomotive also differed in terms of its roof. It was V-shaped, while Alco retained its traditional flat roof across the top. After a thorough testing period, the US ATC decided to go with the GE Alco product instead of the EMD product. It was never made publicly clear as to why this happened. A good guess might be the fact that the Alco 244 was more fuel efficient thanks to its 4-stroke combustion, as well as the fact that it utilized 12 instead of 16 cylinders. There was also the fact that this particular prime mover was turbocharged. This meant better performance at higher altitudes, something this locomotive might encounter in the more mountainous regions, as opposed to the non-turbocharged 2-stroke 16-cylinder prime mover, specifically EMD's 567B, whose performance would actually reduce as altitude increased. Of this final batch of 70 units, which would be produced by Alco for GE, 50 of these units would be equipped with steam generators for utilization on passenger trains. All of the locomotives were delivered with a black gloss paint scheme with white lettering to indicate they were military locomotives. A second batch, which contained 70 of these locomotives, was produced by Alco for GE between March and June of 1952. The service lives of these locomotives were about as uneventful as possible. Upon delivery, these locomotives were sent to the Army's Marietta, Pennsylvania material storage facility, where they were kept in tip-top shape, but really saw very little of any use. It was estimated that some of these locomotives had as little as just a few days' use on them, and at most a few weeks' use. Essentially, the Army continued to preserve them and keep them in excellent tip-top shape. Unfortunately, like all other Cold War military installations, investments, etc., this would be for a conflict that would never come. Essentially, the type of conflict these locomotives were produced to serve in, a large-scale land war / ground invasion, thanks to new enhancements in aircraft and other such technologies, as well as road vehicle technologies, no longer required the utilization of captured railways. The end result, by 1970, after sitting around since the early 50s, all of these locomotives were found to be redundant. The Army now transferred these roughly 30-year-old locomotives to the Navy, where they would be put to use in Navy installations around the country. After serving as little as 4 years for the Navy, some of these locomotives were sold as Army surplus as bargain basement locomotives to railroads, mainly short lines. The Alaskan Railroad comes to mind, who purchased 6 in 1974 and 7 in 1975. As for the rest of these locomotives, some of them were sold to other outfits such as short-line railroads, but the majority of them were scrapped. The main problem facing this locomotive was the infamous 244 power plant. In addition to the fact that its producer, Alco, had gone out of business in the late 1960s, there was the fact that the 244's production had stopped roughly 10 to 15 years before this time. Therefore, parts to keep this prime mover with its questionable reliability record running were becoming ever hard to come by. And the unfortunate fact of the matter was there were now much more capable and more reliable locomotives available on the used market that would be easier to find parts for, not to mention cost not much more, or even in some cases less, than this locomotive would. The end and unfortunate result of all of this is that many of these locomotives were scrapped, even by the private railroads that purchased them for utilization on their railroad lines. Now, normally at this point in one of my videos, I would simply tell you to keep the metal side down, which, in case anyone is wondering, means keeping your derail-prone 1970s, 80s modeled locomotive on the tracks, as the only thing metal on those engines, comically enough at that time, were the wheels, with the exception of a weight if you were lucky inside the locomotive itself. But in this case, I have a request. As I mentioned before, very few of these locomotives still exist, as most of them were scrapped, in some cases before they even had a chance to really run. All this said, the Pacific Southwestern Railway Museum, who contacted me a while back via one of their members, is in the process of attempting to get one of these locomotives back in service. I strongly encourage all of my subscribers to visit the website of the museum and consider giving a donation to getting this locomotive up and running again. I'll post a link in my video's description. While some might dismiss this locomotive as an ugly duckling, let's remember, Alcos aren't being built anymore, and once they're all gone, they're all gone. Therefore, I encourage all my subscribers, as well as viewers of this video, to consider visiting the museum's website and consider giving a donation toward getting this locomotive back on the rails. And that's going to do it for this video. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If not, thumbs down. Please like and subscribe. And as always, keep the metal side down.